Okay, I think we've started. There's a 10-second delay and I counted 10. I think we're ready to go. So welcome everybody. This is the fourth lecture in the series of volume 1 of Marx's Capital. And in this lecture, we'll be looking at chapters 4, 5 and 6, which deal with the transformation of money into capital. And these are the main bullet points that I'll cover. I will do a review of particularly the back end of chapters 1 to 3, part 1. And then I'll look at each of the 3 chapters that are our focus today and summarize Marx's argument in each of those 3 chapters. And more so than in the past, up to now, I'm going to do some discussion of Marx's approach, especially on the question of labor power. And then, of course, I'll suggest some further reading. This is what we've covered so far. We've looked now at all of chapter 1. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 help us with exchange and money. And we're going to move on to how money becomes capital. And so this is the focus of today. Now, what I've tried to summarize here is the sequence of Marx's presentation. So if you like, this is the steps in cognition, the epistemology, if you like, of how Marx introduces this topic. And he only comes to capital, as we know, once he's established a whole series of concepts, in particular the commodity, value, money is the universal equivalent. And what I've also emphasized, and this is sort of something which I'm reviewing and repeating, is the movement of Marx's argument. And this is a pattern which he uses time and again. He starts off with the initial appearance of the phenomena. He delves into it and tries to see what's behind the initial appearance and moves towards the essence. And this has got a sort of spatial metaphor of going from outer to inner. And then he moves again, once he's established some concept of the essence, he'll move back out to how the essence demonstrates itself on the surface, how it appears. And this is exactly what the standard format of chapters 1, 2, and 3 have been. If we think of this as a result rather than the steps in learning about it, this is how I summarize the result. A clear focus on the commodity, but the commodity in terms of both its value and its use value. And then he explains what the actual content of value is. The substance of value has socially necessary labor time. And furthermore, and this is a big breakthrough by Marx, he looks at the form of value, what he calls the value form, how value appears in circulation. And Marx visits this twice, and the more developed analysis, he comes up with the role of money as universal equivalent and how money expresses itself as a price. Excuse me. So what we have, and it's a point which I'm making now because it's very important for going forward, is the intersection of the realm of production and the realm of circulation. The commodity exists in both. Commodity is both produced, it also circulates. And this is summarized here. In terms of value, value is created, according to Marx, in production, by labor in production. It's expressed in the form of the commodity as the commodity is presented on the market, presented for sale, and it's expressed in the price, which is why I put this line here, before it's actually sold. And then in the selling of the commodity, which is the exchange with the money, the value is realized. So there are, if you like, 3 phases. They all presuppose each other, but there's also a sort of a step-by-step movement in the life of any given commodity. And just taking this point further again, what Marx develops is the idea that production of commodities is in a commodity producing and exchanging society, produced by producers who are isolated from each other. This is a private realm. The producers are in a common pattern of production, a social division of labor, but the way that they interconnect with each other is not directly as laborers, but it's through the products of their labor, through the commodities as they move in circulation. So circulation and the exchange with money is the commonality, if like the meeting point, the marketplace in commodity production. So you have one realm, which is the social division of labor, where value is created, and you have another realm where value is expressed and realized, which is the realm of appearance of value. And Marx explains how this configuration, this social configuration, gives rise to various kinds of fetishism, where the relationship of producers only appears and takes the form of the relationship between the objects of their production, the commodities which they produce. And therefore, social relationships appear as attributes of the commodities. So what we have, this is summarizing here. This is a very dialectical picture. He's got concept of a totality here, which is built around unity and different poles or contrasting realms within that unity. The other point to make at this point in Marx's argument is the commodity is definitely a product of labor, but it's a bit abstract and general what that labor is. He does give examples, but it's not finely developed what labor really is. This is also one I've shown you before, and I want to come back to it just to emphasize certain points. So Marx starts off with a commodity as the elementary form of the capitalist mode of production. What he's actually done is he's looked at the elementary form of the commodity. It's a simplified picture of the commodity. It's not the full picture, which he's going to develop as we go through the 3 volumes of the commodity as it is in capitalist production. And in particular, what he's done in his first part is he's abstracted from class division. He knows it's going to come, but at this initial stage, it's implicit rather than explicit. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to move from this implicit reality of the capital-labor relationship to it becoming quite explicit. And that's really important because in the movement from money to capital, we also discover, in the way Marx presents it, the relationship between capital and labor, and in particular, his concept of surplus value. The main body of Volume 1 is about Marx's theory of surplus value, and these are 3 sort of sections of that main central part. And what he's looking at there in the relationship between labor and capital is the most essential category set of relations of the capitalist mode of production. So it's back to essence again. So if we summarize what's going on in this first part, the commodity and money part helps win all the volumes. But in order to get in the rest of the argument into Volume 1, we have to have this further transition, which moves from money to capital. And Marx explains his concept of capital as being self-expanding value. So if you recall, in the form of the commodity and money, when these social objects exchange, value is actually preserved. But what we've got now is a form of value which expands. That's its very nature, that's in its character, that it's an expanding form of value, which we'll look at in some more detail. And the second major point, which is central to his transition into the main argument in Volume 1, which we're going to look at in this lecture, is that capital encounters a commodity which is crucial in terms of its ability to expand its own value, and that is labor power. So labor power is actually the secret of capital's expansion. In chapter 3, when Marx was telling us about the circulation of commodities and money. He introduced this form, commodities, money, commodity. This he presents this as two poles of a sequence. A metamorphosis is the term he uses, where the producer of one commodity, it has enough of that commodity. They're not really interested anymore in its use value. They want to use it as a means to exchange for money so that they can buy another commodity with a different use value and one which they do want. So the maker of chairs would like a table to go with their chairs, so they have to sell some chairs in order to get the money to buy the table. So in this CMC, there's a preservation of the exchange value. That doesn't change. What changes from one pole of this to the other is the use value. Start off with chairs, you end up with a table. Okay. And of course, the maker of tables will also, I mean, Marx is a rather more humorous example, with Bibles being exchanged through money for whiskey and so on. None of these exchanges are direct. They always take the form of first an exchange for money, and then a sale, and then a purchase with the money for the next commodity. And once again, Marx explains this very well in chapter 3. There are actually two relations here. One is the setting of the price, and then one is the actual exchange, the actual sale, the exchange itself. Okay, so I try to indicate that there. Right, so this is already discussed by Marx in chapter 3. It's an important link point into what we're going to look at in a little while. But just taking Marx's development of the argument a little bit further in chapter 3, he then looks at money. And he looks at this process of CMC, and he tells us actually in these different exchanges and so on, in these different relations, money has different functions in different steps of the way. And he develops that idea. So I've just numbered here the different ones he brings out. So money starts off as a measure of value in this sequence. It's not actually present. You don't need a pile of gold to set a price, but the seller will say, okay, my commodity is worth half an ounce of gold, whatever it might be. And that's either confirmed or not when they come to the actual sale. Whether they get half an ounce of gold for their commodity, we'll find out when they sell it. Marx explains that the precious metals started off as being the coins, but they were actually symbols of themselves for various reasons, including corruption by the state, by kings basically robbing the metal out of the coins and all other things. You don't really need the metal in there because it's a symbol of its own value. So very soon coins became a symbol of the precious metal, and a standard of price was developed. And because it's a symbol, it doesn't just have to be a coin. It doesn't have to be something that looks like a chunk of gold, but it isn't. It can become a piece of paper which says this is a chunk of gold. And so in its role in circulation, once again, gold as such, as the money commodity, does not need to be present. There's a substitute for it, which is a symbol of it. And now, he also looks actually at the distinction which is made on the other side. When a commodity is purchased, it's possible to buy it by saying, I promise as a buyer to pay you at the end of the month. Okay. So there are two movements here as well, actually. One is the exchange of the commodity. And when again, the money is money of account here. It's not actually exchanging hands. It only changes hands at the end of the month. So there's a separation here, which brings about credit. This is a sort of, the buyer is actually a debtor to the seller. The seller's a creditor of the buyer in this situation. Marx is moving away here actually towards capitalist modern type relations. Of course, credit did exist before capitalism, but in his discussion of this, he does move closer to the modern day, or his modern day, because credit is actually a crucial part of the capitalist system and is highly developed in the capitalist system. And one of the reasons he touches on this sort of modernity of the role of money is he brings out the role of the hoard. And the hoard is something where something is sold for money. So if I'm the owner of the table and I'm selling lots of tables, I don't necessarily need to buy loads of chairs. I might just save up the money. And that's the hoard. I mean, money begins to accumulate as an independent form of value in its own right. And that's not just like because I'm also by psychological inclination a hoarder. This will happen as a spontaneous and necessary part of the capitalist mode of production, because as credit develops, then the need to pay off credit at certain points at the ends of the month mean that money will have to be hoarded up and held in reserve in order to pay off the credit. So there's a sort of a clear function in the way the system works for the need for these sort of modern hoards. And finally, and all these last two are quite important stepping stones into what's going to come next. So Marx, as he almost always does, is very clever in anticipating the next thing, and he's building up, preparing us for the next thing. And the other issue, as well as the hoard, is the world money as a reserve of wealth. I mean, money is power, and in particular, the accumulation of money held in reserve by states is an index of the power of that capitalist nation, basically. And that started before capitalism, when gold was used as a hoard, sort of like the ruling class to hoard the surplus of production in their society. But this role of gold in world international affairs has not gone away. You'll see, actually, if you look at what's happening with Russia today, I mean, gold reserves are part of the news at the moment. What's Russia doing with its gold reserves? So gold plays a function as world money, even to this day. Okay, these things bring us to chapter 4, the point of transition into identifying capital. And Marx, in a way, brings to the fore selected highlights from what he writes in the back end of Capital, which is the historical genesis of the capitalist mode of production. Now, if you've read it, which we recommended in terms of at least some of the chapters at the end of Volume 1 as a good way in to the volume as a whole, you'll recognize some of these things. And he actually selects two key points. The first key point is the forms in which capital emerges from the sort of feudal period into the early stages of capitalism. And Marx does give sort of dates on this. He does talk about 16th century as the beginning of the process. And you will recall he talked about primitive accumulation coming, the levers of primitive accumulation coming into systematic combination at the end of the 17th century in England. So this is a sort of period, the beginnings of the emergence of capitalism, the beginnings of it is in the form of capital as usurious capital, which is lenders basically, and merchants capital, which is trade, money made out of trade, money made in circulation. And so this is the two ways in which capital appears as independent of the power of landed property, Marx emphasizes. Okay, so in the form of money wealth confronts landed property. Okay, so this is, he thinks, is the historical form in which capital appears. This is one starting point from the so-called primitive accumulation. And then he says it's not only historical, you can actually see this in everyday life when money acts as capital. And he begins to explain this. So he's now changing the mode of his argument away from purely historic to, if you look, an analytical one about how capitalism works. And he just posits this as a purely, if you like, formal question. If I just jump back 2 slides, we remember we started off with a commodity, we went to money, and we went back to the commodity. Value is preserved in this cycle. Exchange value of one commodity is the same as the other one. Their use values are different. So there's a quantitative constancy and there's a qualitative difference. Now, what happens when we start with money? Well, if you start with money and buy a commodity, so you're selling, you start with money, so you buy a commodity and then you sell it. So you're buying in order to sell. Okay. Now, if these two exchanges are equivalent values, which is what we've said has to be the case in circulation, then you're going to end up with the same amount of money as you started with. And if you repeat it under those conditions, the same will happen again. Okay. Now, what Marx says is, well, that's slightly absurd. Why would anybody do that, right? And what he posits is that the only reason to do this would be, if you like, a quantitative one, which is to have more money here than you started off with here. And if you go into it again, more money here on the second phase of MCM than you started with. Okay. And he just puts this into a little, not exactly a formula, but an expression, MC. Okay. And then here's his M dash. Now, what M dash is the same as M, but with a bit more M, delta M. This is a sort of standard mathematical presentation. I think it's quite understandable. It's not technical. It's just saying, say this is £100 and this is £10. So you start off with £100, you buy something, you sell that same thing, and you end up with £110. And so the money has expanded from 100 to 110. And this is how merchants work. They buy cheap in order to sell dear. But Marx then begins to problematize this. And in his problematization, he's also shifting from merchants' capital to the beginnings of capital moving into production, i.e. industrial capital. And he does this fairly quietly. He doesn't make a big fanfare about it, but it's important to know that's what's going on. He's going to explain MCM in the context, MCM dash in particular, in the context of what it means for industrial capital, or if you put it another way, for capital moving into manufacture. Okay, so now in chapter 5, he looks at the contradictions in the formula which he's just set up. This is a tactic which Marx uses more than once. He uses it several times. He sees this as kind of like an absurd and impossible situation, which itself needs to be broken down and reconstructed, and from that a new concept will arise. And it's basically this: if there's an exchange of equivalents, then how on earth can you end up with more money than you started with? And in particular, you can't get the delta M but by producing it in circulation. It's possible that some sellers are smarter than some buyers, or they cheat each other and so on, but that has to average out, because there'd be zero sums. If you aggregate the transactions overall, you can't generate value in circulation, because it'll all equal out. So there must be something else. He's saying it has to take place in the background from this MCM. And he says the only explanation is that there's one commodity which has this special function of providing the delta M. And he gives this delta M, this more money, the £10 in our example, a name. He says this is surplus value. Okay, so the source of this delta M is surplus value. And he says there must be a commodity who has got a completely unique and unusual use value. In other words, it's bought in order to consume its use value. And the use value is that it is able to expand its value. So it's not like a normal use value. It's a very special use value. It's that in its consumption, more value is produced. It's a generator of surplus value. That's why an expanding money capital would want to encounter such a commodity. And Marx says, well, basically there is one commodity which does this, and that is labor power. Labor power is the only commodity which it's possible in its consumption to create more value than it itself has, and therefore to create surplus value. Then he moves on to what is labor power. And here we see he selects then the second major outcome of the primitive accumulation, which again, you'll be familiar with or you'll remember. So it's not only that capital emerges on one hand, but that labor power as a commodity emerges on the other hand. In other words, labor power is available on the market as a commodity. A labor market is produced. The social production of a labor market involves massive changes, breakdowns, social class struggles. And the outcome, Marx argues, is that there's a free labourer. And he's very clear that a free labourer is free in a double sense. One, that the labourer is able to dispose of his labour power as his own commodity. And on the other hand, that they can't produce anything else for sale. So they can't get away with growing their own cabbages and selling them in the market, or making their own chairs or making their own tables and selling them in the market. They have to sell their selves, or their labor power of themselves. Okay, so this is the second key result of primitive accumulation. It's the second precondition. And once these two preconditions are met, Marx says this is an epoch-changing situation, right? We have a new epoch of process of social production. Just to be clear, what is labor power? It's the capacity, all those physical, mental capabilities to set oneself to work, okay, to produce use values. Now, labor power, by definition, is not a commodity. This is very important. In lots of societies, people can work. I mean, it's a precondition of society that people are able to work, and they've got the capacity to work, therefore. It's only in a capitalist society that labor power takes on the form of a commodity. In other words, that it's in general available as a commodity in labor markets. It's a sort of a general social condition. And I want to move on to chapter 6, which is on the sale and the purchase of labor power. And I'm going to argue, I'm going to bring in some slightly more evaluation and critical responses. I will say what Marx argues, but I do want to give it some comment as well as we go through. And what I'm going to say is that Marx makes simplifying assumptions of how labor power is commodified. And this is quite normal procedure for Marx, by the way. He is always using simplifications. He has to, in order to control the focus of his argument, in order to control the type and level of abstraction. But in this case, there's quite a lot that follows. There's a large corollary of his simplification, which is he does narrow the scope of what's included in his analysis of the key capitalist social relations. And there's also a tendency, which sort of goes with that, of homogenizing their content. And I'll try to develop that a bit more. And so as a critical comment, more for us than Marx, and Marx is long gone now, I mean, to build on Marx, we need to expand this narrowness and to bring in other specific structural oppressions that are also inherent to the capitalist mode of production. And this I think starts with the question of how labor power is commodified, and I'll try to explain this. So in chapter 6, Marx explains what he's going to do, right? He's going to look at labor power in and for itself, where its exchange, he says the exchange of commodities, he's talking about labor power, implies no other relations of dependence than those which result from its own nature. On this assumption, labor power can appear on the market as a commodity only if and insofar as its possessor, the individual whose labor power it is, offers it for sale or sells it as a commodity. That is, they sell their own labor power. Okay. In actual fact, Marx knows this is a simplifying assumption, because in chapter 10, which is very rich in different forms of exploitation in his time, one of the big issues was the implementation of the Factory Acts in England in the sort of 3 decades before Capital was published. Marx follows this very closely. He's very well versed in these struggles, and he reports them in a very clear way. And one of the things he brings out is that there was a lot of battles over child labor in this period. And he actually points out how many capitalists found workarounds to keep on employing children, even though the Factory Acts were supposed to curtail it increase the age from 7 to 9, make sure that children in all the key sectors couldn't be employed. And there were lots of workarounds, and the capitalists found them, pretty much all of them. And Marx explains that despite the new laws, the Factory Acts, branches of industry would exploit children without legal limits to their exploitation. He calls this at one point their unfettered exploitation. And so, for example, children were not supposed to work for so many hours at a time. So what the capitalists did is they made them work on split shift, 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours in the evening. And they also pushed them into night work and so on. Okay, so he explains all of this, Marx, very well, I think, actually. And if you want to see a very good dramatization of this period, I recommend looking at The Mill from Channel 4. It's a drama series, but it's based, it's very much a docudrama based on a mill in Cheshire, which a lot of documentation of what happened in that mill. So in other words, there's a dependency here, is what I'm finally getting at. The children were not really selling their own labor power. They were either taken from orphanages, or under dire circumstances, no doubt, parents would be effectively selling their children into these types of employment. And so they were exploited in an unfettered way without limits. There's a second condition that Marx puts on what is labor power and the way it's presented as a commodity. We've already said that labor power is his own property. Marx emphasizes this, his own commodity. He can do this only by placing it at the disposal of the buyer, i.e. handing it over to the buyer for him to consume for a definite period of time, temporarily. In this way, he manages to both alienate his labor power, that's the worker, and to avoid renouncing his rights of ownership over it. Okay, it's pretty clear that those conditions were not met when you're talking about enslaved African and African descendant laborers. Even if you, let's leave aside for the time being the question of the plantations in the earlier period, but in Marx's lifetime and in this period that he's writing about, there was a major question of slavery in the US cotton South. I mean, during the period of the Factory Acts, there were also the massive movements in the US cotton South, providing the cotton which was being spun and weaved in those very same factories. And it's at this point that cotton enters into the narrative of capital for the first time. And it is actually the leading example all the way through. In other words, most of Marx's examples, not all of them, but these leading examples are taken from the factories of spinning and weaving. But what about the laborers who produced the cotton that was then spun and weaved? And in his, I have to be quite careful about this because Marx wrote a lot actually about the US South, and he wrote some very good things about it, I have to say. And in general, he certainly supported the revolt of the enslaved, and he supported the North in the Civil War. It was an alliance of different forces, and he was, I think, quite aware of that as well. But if you question how much he analyzed and how fully he analyzed the enslavement of African labor, I mean, he has a lot of insights which are actually very good, but he never had the time or the opportunity or whatever to bring it all into focus. And I think, there's ambiguities. I think it's incomplete. So the category of enslaved labor, which I would argue, and many do, I'm not original in saying this, right, was completely intrinsic to the main industrial capitalism of that time. I mean, to talk about a commodity chain, this was it. Cotton was the main commodity chain of industrial capitalism, right? So it's a category which relates to capitalist exploitation. And that category itself needs, and Marx's conceptual apparatus do allow us to examine enslaved African labor and to see it as another mode of exploitation within the capitalist system, but absolutely clearly one which was more oppressive and more exploitative, one where the laborers were not free, one where they did not have control of their own labor power, and so on. So it has its very strong racial particularities as well. But I think it's quite right that we should extend Marx to include this as part of the exploited labour force. In chapter 6, Marx finally discusses, if we're talking about labour power, then and it's a commodity, then it too must have its own value. What is the exchange value of labour power? And Marx gives two slightly different definitions, core definitions, if you like, and those are on the left of my slide here. He says is determined by the subsistence consumed, the means of subsistence, and the labor time therefore necessary for the production of those means of subsistence. And at other points, I guess he takes them as direct synonyms. He writes about it's the labor power is formed by the value of the commodities which have been consumed, and therefore they're bought on the market. And he develops this. I mean, it's quite he gives it quite some attention. He notes that it's not just about the food that you eat on a day-to-day basis, nor the clothes that you might buy on a month or year-to-year basis, but it's a generational question. Labor power has to be reproduced in terms of a new generation of workers, and so this is part of the value of labor power, which needs to be included. And labor power, when it is becoming available to capitalism, needs to be educated and trained. So this also is a consumption, which is the more developed labor power. The value would increase. And he also says clearly this isn't just a technical issue. This is very much a social question of the class struggle. What is the value of labor power depends on historical and moral conditions at any given time. We've already seen differences in what might be considered the value of labor power, what might be an acceptable wage, if you like, in exchange for labor power. Now, this is another area where I think Marx's argument needs further development. And what Marx is he's not wrong about the value of labor power. It's just that he doesn't investigate what's wrong about that. And if the value of labor power is just the value of the commodities which go into labor power, there's still a massive missing element, which is the labor which goes into the reproduction of labor power, which is, in general terms, takes place in the family, in the household. In general terms, it's performed by women. In general terms, it's not paid. It's free in a different sense. It's unpaid. It's gratis. And so this is a crucial reason why labor power's value is kept low, because what it's constituted of is not just commodities like, the food you buy at the shop, but the preparing of the food, the shopping even, and the preparing of it, and the cooking of the meal, and the washing up, and all this is work. So all this work is not recognized actually, in fact, in the capitalist system as contributing a value, but it's necessary, just as necessary as labor power in production is necessary in order to produce and reproduce labor power. So I think domestic and caring labor, and of course, again, I'm absolutely not original in saying this, but I do think we should bring this in terms of Marx's consideration of labor power. The question of the capitalist social relations being a configuration which necessarily leads to women's oppression because of the role of unpaid domestic and caring labor in the production of labor power. And so this is me rather than Marx. What I want to introduce, and I signaled right at the very beginning about labor super exploitation, is that the capitalist mode of production generates inequalities in the social relations of the working class as regards the reproduction of the labor force, labor power, as we've just looked at, in the terms of the conditions of labor, and in terms of the mode and degree of exploitation. And these are not economic as such, these are social and economic. And so what is invariably involved are different particular configurations of oppression: gender, race, region, in terms of how Marini argued about labor super exploitation. And these are intrinsic. They're not just matters of policy. these are structural at the general level in terms of how labour power is formed and valued in capitalist social relations. And so in terms of the consequences of what's been argued here for Marx's theory in Capital, I don't think it's a root and branch change. I see it as a critical development. In other words, I think that these forms of oppression by the capitalist mode of production can be integrated with his core concept of surplus value. The core concept needs some development, but it still services to help explain these oppressions. We have to say that wage labour is not the only mode in which capitalist exploitation takes place. It is the most general mode, but it's not the only mode. And all of these oppressions are integral to capitalist mode of production as a mature mode of production, and they can't be, they should not be framed as primitive accumulation. Rather, they're part of the reproduction of modern capitalism. And so what this means for our reading of Marx, this is looking ahead now to the main parts of Volume 1. And as I've already sort of signaled, the main parts of Volume 1 are about the labour process and about the reduction in capitalism of surplus value. And so at certain points, I will be highlighting where I think Marx's concept of surplus value can be developed to take into account what I've been signalling. He certainly goes a long way in various respects. He goes, more than halfway sometimes, but it needs more conceptual, theoretical consolidation, I think. Okay, this is the last slide. There won't be a lecture on the 23rd of May, just because of the pace of the lectures is actually a bit faster than the pace of our reading group. So I've worked out the weekly progress of the groups, and I think we'll come into perfect harmony around about the 20th of June. So that's when the next lecture will be, and it will be about surplus value and then onwards from there. And I've given, these are massive topics in their own right, and these are not meant to be comprehensive reading lists by any means whatsoever, but they are sort of some indicative readings if you're interested in these aspects. And of course, you can go to the main readings in the handout, the various primers in terms of this section. There's not an awful lot of academic debate about this section. Actually, there's been a load of debate about part 1, but not very much debate in the literature about chapters 4, 5, and 6. So in fact, I'm trying to generate some new debate about them. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. I'll stop sharing and welcome any discussion.